Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So it is July, it is full-on summer, and all this month we are talking to Engineers Without Borders USA. I'm calling it EJ with EWB because they have a brand new environmental justice and climate resilience initiative that they've kicked off. And so I wanted to know more about it. I needed to have some answers. And so for this first episode in the series, we were able to talk to Kellianne McClain. She is the Officer of Individual Giving at EWB-USA, and she is the one who began and created this campaign, this Environmental Justice and Climate Resilience Initiative. It was her idea. And so she's the first one in this series that we're talking to. We had a great conversation last week. I really enjoyed speaking to her. We went through all kinds of different topics in our conversation. We talked about environmental justice. We talked about her background and where she grew up, how she was educated, what her previous advocacy work was, things like human rights and environmental justice and fundraising, all kinds of things that she was involved in. We even talked about the background of EWB-USA, how it got started, what its mission is, what the history of that organization is, and what their history is as it relates to environmental justice. And then we dove right into the initiative, what it's trying to accomplish, what its purpose is, its goals. Are there any partners, collaborators? Where does it stand right now? How does it shift the way EWB operates? I wanted to know all those different things. So we had a nice conversation about that. And finally, I wanted to know how to get involved. How can we actually participate in the initiative? You might think because it's Engineers Without Borders that you have to be an engineer. That's not the case. She clarified that for me, and she really talked about different ways that we can get involved and really support the initiative. So I hope you enjoy the interview. I enjoyed having a conversation. I think you'll learn a lot just listening to her speak about the organization, about her own experiences. I think it was really helpful to hear. I enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy it too. So without further ado, here is my interview with Kellianne McClain of EWB USA on the Environmental Justice Lab. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we have a special guest with us. Her name is Kellianne McClain. She is the Officer of Individual Giving at EWB, and she is going to speak to us about the environmental justice and climate resilience initiative that they have going on. I am so excited. Kellianne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm really excited to be here today.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're here too. There's just so much to talk about. But first, can you tell us about your background, maybe where you're from, your education, if whatever previous work you've done, how you got to EWB, and also your passion and the things that you really care about as you continue to do your work at EWB?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for giving me a little bit of space to talk about that. So first of all, I just want to say right off of the bat, even though I work at Engineers Without Borders, I am not an engineer by any means. I work on our communications and fundraising department. So it's always my pleasure to talk about the fantastic work that our engineers are doing, the fantastic work that our volunteers are doing. I actually grew up out here in Denver, which is where Engineers Without Borders USA's office is based. I also lived on the East Coast for a little while when I was in middle school and high school. Ended up going to American University in DC, where I studied international relations and human rights. And that really is where I fell in love with the type of work that Engineers Without Borders is currently doing and the type of work that we're doing to really make the world a better place. My first few jobs after finishing up school were actually working on different advocacy and fundraising campaigns back out here in Denver on behalf of groups like Amnesty International, on behalf of groups like Save the Children. So I really do like to approach a lot of the work that I do at Engineers Without Borders with a little bit of a human rights lens and a human rights background there.
Oh, that's interesting. So, okay, before we go any further, tell me about the human rights connection. I haven't really thought about human rights in relation to what Engineers Without Borders is doing. Do you see a connection there? And is there one with human rights and environmental justice? Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that anytime you're talking about justice, human rights always becomes an element in that. But specifically with the work that Engineers Without Borders does and the work that the entire field of international development does, I do really see a lot of that as a fulfillment of human rights in a certain type of way. So academically speaking, a lot of times human rights get put into two different types of categories. So you have negative human rights, which are, I think typically what comes to mind when you hear the word human rights. You think about freedom of speech or freedom to move about or to live free from torture. It's something that somebody either needs to take away from you or do to you in order to have your rights infringed on. But then there's this whole other section of rights that a lot of times we refer to as positive human rights, which are things like, the right to access clean water, the right to sanitation, the right to education. And in a certain sense, those rights are always thought of in a little bit of a different way because it takes an action for those to be fulfilled, whether it's from the community level, whether it's the government, whether it's a nonprofit organization. There's somebody working to make sure that you have that access to that water, that you have access to education. And when we think about the type of work that Engineers Without Borders does, most of our projects are water projects. We're working to make sure that people have access to water, that they're able to wash their hands when they walk into a healthcare facility, or that they're able to reconnect to an electrical grid after a disaster or a hurricane happens. So in that sense, the work that we do, I really think always has been a type of fulfillment of those positive human rights. And then when we talk about the environmental justice aspect of it, that work really, it reconnects because we're working with communities that are generally underserved or communities that have been systemically denied of certain resources or ability to access things like clean water, things like sustainable infrastructure. And that's really where that connection starts to happen.
Nice. That's very interesting. And of course, to continue to think about Engineers Without Borders, can you talk more about the organization itself? Maybe some of its history, its mission, and then when it comes to environmental justice specifically, how has EWB moved into fighting for environmental justice?
Yeah, absolutely. So EWB has been around for 21 years now. We just had our 20-year anniversary last year. We were founded by a professor at CU Boulder, Bernard Amadei. A community reached out to him in Belize, I believe, and he went there to kind of assess their infrastructure and to look into projects to help bring them, water, to help bring them electricity. And from that, Engineers Without Borders was founded. He went back the next year with a group of students. He has a whole TED talk about it, so I don't want to touch too much just on the founding there. But in the last 20 years, the organization has tremendously grown. We have, over 240 chapters, both student and professional, at various universities around the country. Various cities throughout the country have their own professional chapters as well. And each of those chapters typically takes on projects. They form connections with communities, and they really work to build up the infrastructure that's needed. So we've grown a lot. We have all of those professional and student chapters that are out there working on projects. We have hundreds of active projects at any given time. And as an organization, we really have been taking this justice element into consideration for some time, and especially environmental justice. So dating back to 2011, which was about 10 years after EWB-USA was founded, Bernard Amadei, he actually gave a TED Talk at TEDx Mile High. And he touched on a lot of different topics. He touched on engineering for the other 90% of the world's population. It's a really moving speech, But in particular, I think that's one of the first times in our organization's archives that I can see environmental justice specifically mentioned. And he talks about it in the sense of that age-old term of, you can teach a man to fish and he'll eat for life, or you can give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. But if you're teaching a man to fish, there's also so many other elements that need to be in play there. The water needs to be, free, and that water needs to be flowing, and it needs to be clean, and there have to be fish in the pond. And what happens when the climate starts to affect that, or when environmental degradation starts to affect that? How do we fix that? That becomes the field of environmental justice. And when it comes to these complex things like water systems, when it comes to ecosystems or structures, that's really where engineers have a big part and a big responsibility to play within this field. So that, trend really continued in 2014. Our Community Engineering Corps, or CE Corps, as we call them sometimes, they were founded, and they specifically deal with projects here in the United States and helping communities really access the funding that they need to solve infrastructure issues within their communities. And by 2018, 2019, we were starting to take climate change and climate change considerations into our whole project planning process. Every time a community applies for a project and a chapter adopts that project to take it on, they have to go through certain parameters to make sure that they're looking at the way that climate might affect that project down the road and making sure that it can be sustainable. In 2020, we actually put out a statement as an organization, really recognizing human-caused climate change and standing in support of Sustainable Development Goal 13, which is for a clean climate. And then, of course, the pandemic happened as travel allowed, after restrictions started to ease up. In 2022, we went on these big impact trips where we were able to visit projects that, had been completed anywhere between 1 and 10 years ago, and really see how well those projects were holding up, how sustainable they were. But more importantly, we were able to talk to members within each and every community and hear their experiences about how the projects have impacted their life, but also how climate change is affecting their community and whether or not the projects are helping them adapt to that. And by and large, we found that a lot of our projects have helped these communities be more resilient in the face of climate change, which brings us to this year and us formally putting out our Environmental Justice and Climate Resilience Initiative. So really, we're not starting anything new. We're not reinventing the wheel, but we're cohesively talking and thinking about all of these environmental justice related projects that we've been doing, the projects that we want to take on, and really what the climate considerations are, what the resiliency considerations are, and at the end of the day, what the justice element to it is. So this initiative is really a way of talking and thinking about that work in a way that we can more efficiently and effectively direct our resources, and in a way that we can use our platform, as an organization that has over 14,000 volunteers, as an organization that a lot of people look to, how we can use that platform for advocacy on this topic.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And let's just talk more about the initiative. Can you tell me more about what you're actually trying to do with it? I understand there's a fundraising goal. I think it was 50,000 that I'm sure you've met. If you can share anything more about what the initiative is going to actually do and what the goals are for it, I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a certain sense, even though environmental justice and climate change have been priorities for us for a while, this initiative is really the start of a new journey right now. So we kicked off the initiative with a 6-week fundraising push. We were looking for about $50,000 from the community to really help get us started with where we're going for our climate justice and for our environmental justice and climate resiliency initiatives. And fortunately, we did hit that goal. We actually surpassed it. Right now, we're sitting at a little bit less than $70,000. You can definitely still donate if you want to, but it's enough to really get us started. And what we're trying to do here with this initiative, and I won't get into too much detail because you'll be talking with some much more intelligent people from our programs team later on in this series, is we're trying to go in and rethink how we go about taking on climate projects. How are we monitoring them? What considerations are we taking into place? How are we sharing those best practices from one chapter to the next? How are we sharing those best practices with the rest of the community that's involved in similar work to what we do? And, what really does the future look like? How do we engineer for a more climate resilient future? Because there are a lot of amazing environmental groups that are working on stopping the effects of climate change or reversing them. But there are people who are already feeling the impacts and the effects of climate change and the effects of environmental degradation. And how do we engineer for those people? How do we build that resilience? So it's really an initiative to advance that work in a much more strategic way.
Perfect. So would you say that this initiative is kind of advancing what you've already been doing? Are you trying to add more to what you've been doing? How does this fit with the whole overall organizational's mission and goals?
Yeah, I would say that it's both. So it's advancing work that we've already done, but it is also looking at ways that we can do this work better going forward, that we can really take climate into consideration even more going forward and make sure that we are developing and advancing as an organization for this next decade and for the decades to come, and that we are growing and responding to what the current challenges in the world are. And as it relates to our mission and to our goals, so our big mission is really to partner with communities and to develop leaders for a better world. And I think it goes into both. We're partnering with communities. We're looking for ways to help them build that resiliency. And along the way, I know you previously were a volunteer with EWB. We're working with our volunteers and really trying to build these leaders of tomorrow who are thinking about the challenges that are facing our world in a different way. How are they thinking about climate change? How are they thinking about working with communities? How are they thinking about the rights issues that are involved when we take on these projects and the justice elements that are involved as well? So really, it does come down to like a little bit of a holistic approach that we're taking.
Great. Are there any partners, any collaborators, any other organizations that you're kind of working alongside as you advance this particular initiative? Or is this an EWB initiative going forward?
Yeah, so I will say that we always work in partnership with communities. So when we're working with communities, we're working with communities themselves. We are typically partnering with local nonprofits who are in the area as well. And then, of course, we do have our partners who are really tremendous donors to us. So I do want to say the Fortive Foundation was actually really generous in getting this initiative started. They matched over $25,000 worth of gifts during our big fundraising push for this initiative. But they're by no means our only partner. We do work alongside a lot of other groups to really accomplish this.
And so how can we get involved? How can those of us listening, those of us who might listen to this later, how can we get involved with this initiative?
Yeah, so there are so many ways to get involved with Engineers Without Borders USA and the work that we're doing right now. Specifically, if you really want to see the work that we're doing right now for environmental justice, for climate resiliency, if you're curious about that, and if you maybe want to donate or just learn more, I would advise you to visit EWB-USA.org/give. That's the page where, at least through the next few months, all of our environmental justice information will be living. That's definitely where you can donate and learn more from. And then while you're on our website, you can also look at our volunteer opportunities. So in the top, I believe, right-hand corner of the website, you'll see an option for volunteering. And you can see if there's a chapter that's close to you that you would be able to get involved with. And there's a variety of ways to do that. I mean, if you are an engineer or an engineering student, you can, of course, join a chapter and take on a project. If you're, maybe further on in your career and you have time to advise, we're always looking for mentors and for advisors for our chapters. And you by no means have to be an engineer either. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I'm not an engineer whatsoever. I work in our fundraising and communications department. And our chapters need that type of support as well. A lot of our chapters take on the funding for the individual projects that they're working on. And, they take on that funding for their travel and for their implementation. So just having somebody who can volunteer time to help them with that fundraising and with that communication is also really valuable.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And so you heard what she said. Go online, give, get involved, look for a local chapter, do whatever you can to help advance this initiative. I think it's a great initiative that EWB is doing. I think we should all be engaged in some form in helping to assist these communities that they're serving in being resilient to climate change and also pushing back on some of the environmental justice issues that they're seeing. I am really excited about this initiative. I'm excited about this series moving forward in the podcast. And I am so thankful that Kellianne was able to join us today for this episode. Kellianne, thank you so much for your time and for your work. Continue to do great things. I so appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for having this podcast and really getting these issues out there for the public. I think it's really important, and I appreciate what you're doing.
Perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being on the episode. And that is all we have for today. Thank you for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.